Welcome to the Astrology and Spirituality Show for week commencing the 7th of June with Elise and Patrick. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a giant week because we have that solar eclipse in the sign of Gemini, combining with the retreating Mercury and the Moon, but all of them are squaring the dreamy and rather soggy influence of Neptune. Because Gemini is very much about clarity, I think over the next half year we're going to have to work hard to try and keep that clarity of thought. And because for the Western world there is some signs of coming out of lockdown, it's not so easy elsewhere. I think there's going to be a continuing fluidity around travel restrictions, what we can do and can't do around mixing and mingling. Also this week we continue to have a big standoff between the two rulers of Scorpio, Mars and Pluto, which has been going on all month. And we could encounter someone who's being rather bloody minded, or we may feel that we want to be more willful in achieving our desires too. Now, Elisa, the Hermetic wheel last week was the Nine of Swords, which I know you've said is very much to do with sort of sleepless nights and feeling quite worrisome. But I believe on Thursday that the Hermetic wheel actually goes into, from what I know, one of the toughest cards of all, which is the Ten of Swords. So
on Thursday, we are transitioning into that Ten of Swords. And the Ten of Swords is feeling like we are defeated in some way. It's depicted as a guy on the ground with 10 swords sticking out of his back. He may have been betrayed. He may have been walked over. He may just feel like he's lost his way completely. But the great thing about this is he's hit that point, and now we can learn to grow from it and grow through it. So we're coming to the end of that. Next week, we have a much better energy coming up, which I'm not going to tell you about until next week.
Drum roll.
But we just got to get through this 9-10 of swords energy first and use this time to really look within about what we want to change about our circumstances, the things that we do have control.
So the only way is up from Thursday.
The only way is up from Thursday.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Now, Pradeep has written in and said, come on, Patrick, it's obvious that you like the astrology more than the tarot. Pradeep, I'm like a referee. I can't reveal my favourite football team. Obviously, I'm very passionate about the astrology, but I'm incredibly respectful of what Elisa brings to the show with the modalities, whether it is tarot or the oracle cards or any of the other great strands of insight that she brings. And speaking of that, Elisa, you're going to talk about the Mercury Retrograde situation, because we had Emma has written in and says she's got Mercury Retrograde in her natal chart. What does it mean for people with a natal Mercury Retrograde when we have a transiting Mercury Retrograde? What's your take on that?
Well, they're very equipped to deal with it because they've got it natally, and so therefore, Emma, you've had this throughout your whole life. You've had this practice to deal with it. So whilst everyone else is running around trying to figure out how to cope with Mercury in retrograde, you've had a lifetime of dealing with it.
Does it make people perhaps deeper thinkers who might have a Mercury Retrograde?
Definitely deeper
natally?
thinkers. Definitely people that find humour in situations very quickly. What you may also have if you've got Mercury in retrograde natally is that the miscommunications that can happen in Mercury in retrograde can just happen throughout your life, where you feel like you've said something to someone but you didn't actually verbalize it. That can be something of a frustration. But if we think of people like Steve Jobs, the pop singer Madonna, Lady Gaga, these are people that also have it. They're free thinkers and they think outside the box.
That's brilliant. And also the other thing to say, when people focus on one particular issue within the map, the nativity, like a Mercury retrograde, sometimes it can be to the exclusion of how other influences link to that particular thing. So for example, in my natal chart, I have Venus retrograde. So it's said that Venus retrograde people tend to marry late or not at all, or tend to be quite independent. But you then have to look at what zodiac sign that position's in. So where does the Mercury retrograde reside? And if it resides in Gemini or Virgo, which are the two signs governed by Mercury, or is it in an area where Mercury doesn't do so well? So if you had Mercury retrograde in the sign of Pisces, that's a really watery, moist location to have Mercury, which relies on logic. So that's not the best position to have it natally. And then if you had Saturn or Pluto on your Mercury retrograde, that would bring an even greater set of power and perhaps challenge or opportunity, depending on what planets are interacting. So it's very difficult to look at something in total isolation. Now, we did also have a word of the week suggested by Anima about 4 weeks ago. Our apologies, Anima, we just didn't have time to follow it, and it is atemporal. Now, this is fascinating. It's a fantastic word, as we acknowledged at the time, and really, it kind of means a lack of time. So a timelessness. So if you could think about it in these terms, if astrology is the measurement of time in terms of the emotional patterns that the planetary movements create or can trigger within us, I would say atemporal was almost the antithesis of astrology in a way.
Yeah.
It's kind of letting go of measurements, isn't it?
Yeah, so maybe using those two forces together, although they're polar opposites, they're of the same polar line, aren't they? They're both about time. And so it's interesting, that word. I really love it.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, and thank you so much for sharing that, Anima. Now, Katrina has also written and said, Patrick, how do we break down an analysis beyond just the transits and the natal horoscope? So we have the nativity, what we're born with, then we have the planets moving in the sky that trigger certain positions. So say, for example, your sun was 27 degrees in Capricorn, and at the moment we've got Pluto very close to that. That would be supremely transformational for that individual. But what Katrina's asking is, what about when we apply secondary progressions? Well, secondary progressions is where it's a very ancient form of astrological forecasting where, say someone is 25 years old, we count forwards 25 days from the time they were born, and we take that snapshot of where the planetary activity has moved to after that time. Now, because 25 days is not a very long time, the planet that moves most frequently is the moon. So that's the one that's sweeping forwards. But the sun and the ascendant, as Katrina recognises, they do move forwards those 25 degrees. How does that affect things? How do we break that down? How do we make it meaningful? It's a brilliant question. And I think essentially we could say that the nativity is the potential that we're given at the outset of our life. We can learn to work with the challenging aspects, which could be considered some of those retrogrades, and then we overcome them. But the progressions is the continuing journey of our experience. So as the planets move, it can trigger some big changes within us. So for example, my progressed sun moved into Aries about 2 3/4 years ago. And for the last year or two that it was in Pisces, I could feel that there was a change coming. In fact, 29 degrees in astrology is a very powerful point called the inertic degree. But once the sun moved into Aries, the hermit phase that I'd gone through for 30 years with the progression of the sun through Pisces, I'm born an Aquarius, suddenly I emerged and I've had a lot more drive, a lot more sort of King of Wands type energy. I'm wanting to enact an energy that's instant, that's exciting. I want to change my life. I met Elisa. We've changed the house. We're moving home. So you can see that that progressed sun is working very, very powerfully. And also what can happen in progressions is that over a longer period of time, particular aspects can start to be formed. So you could have a lucky one. You could have, for example, Jupiter coming into a trine in your progressions that you didn't have in your natal horoscope, and that could create more luck for you as time goes on. So the skill of breaking down the nativity, the progressions, the solar return for the influence of that particular year, or the more modern form of forecasting called directions, comes down to the astrologer explaining this as clearly as possible to the client, but also making sure that we understand that we all have a divine right to grow, or we can stay being completely affected by a natal horoscope, and we're not really evolving. If we really get into astrology, we can see how the evolution of our souls, of our experience on this earth, can become such an exciting thing. Now, we do have a birthday winner this week. Now, it isn't someone who left their details on the last show. It was on the show before, and her name is Sophie. Now, because of confidentiality reasons, we're not saying surnames now. So Sophie V, who was born on the 9th of June 1979, 8:03 p.m. in Melbourne in Australia. Now, as ever, Sophie, I don't take much time to look at charts, because I think we've done this live on Facebook and on YouTube, and it's almost like riding those motorcycles with no brakes around the wall. What do they call it? Is it the wall of death?
Yeah.
Well, just put on the spot and I have to go. So the interesting thing about your chart is that it's 17 degrees in Gemini, so you're going to be very close to this solar return this week. But when you were born, Neptune was opposite your sign. So I think it's true to say, because your sun's in the very self-expressive, joyful and friendly 5th house, very much to do with creativity and warmth, but because you've got Neptune opposite, and you've also got the moon in the 11th house too, and your moon and Venus are opposite, and your Neptune and your sun are opposite, I think you've probably been quite idealistic about friendships and associations. You also have Pluto at 16 degrees in Libra, right at the top of your chart on your midheaven. So I think work, professional interactions have been important to you. Now, your midpoint between the Sun, 17 Gemini, and 3 Sagittarius is actually 10 degrees Virgo. So I think you're someone with powers of great discrimination. You can get into the detail of things. And because you have the North Node very close to your midpoint at 10 degrees Virgo and right close to Saturn too, I think all in the 8th house, I think you're someone who's very analytical. So something around finance has been an opportunity for you. It could be management, it could be something to do with financial services or advisory work, or that could be an area that's actually been a bit of a struggle for you, or it's where you've had shared resources. And because Neptune is in opposition to your sun, and I feel there probably has been disappointments, that could go all the way to deceptions at time. But you do have a glorious, fortunate conjunction between Jupiter and the part of fortune in the sign of Leo in your 7th house. And you also have Mercury, not at its best in Cancer, but it is on the Earth point, 0 degrees, in the 6th house. So again, emphasizing that ability you have for precision, but there's another part of you that's very idealistic. There's no doubt about that at all. And because Pluto and the Sun are in a trine, I think it's likely that your professional work, whether it has been working for yourself, whether you've been entrepreneur, I think has been an evolution, using that word again. I think you've tried different things. Now, in terms of what's going to happen for you this year, I think something about where you live is likely to be at the core of your situation. There's a lot of activity in your 4th house, but also the midpoint for you is 7 degrees in Gemini, in the 3rd house, which is very Gemini-like energy. But you do have Pluto and Saturn in your 11th house of your future plans. And Pluto and Mars, a bit like they are this week, they're in your solar return. So I think there could be some big changes going on in terms of your long-term direction. And perhaps you're going to have to fight to assert what you want. But if some of those changes are to do with friendships or where you live, who you live with and how, it wouldn't be a surprise. Now, Elisa, what is the modality? What's the card of the week that you've chosen?
Well, this week we're going to use the Healing with the Angels Oracle cards, because going back to the beginning of the video with that 9 of Swords, 10 of Swords energy, that can be very intense, very heavy. These are very light and very loving.
Oh, that's so lovely,
so
darling.
it's a nice juxtaposition, I think.
Thank you so much to all our subscribers. If you've yet to subscribe, we'd be very grateful if you would hit that subscribe button. And because the more people that do, the more that YouTube will share our videos. Also, I've done a special on Harry and Meghan. It's proven to be quite controversial. It's a very polarising subject. I've tried to stay strictly neutral. Some people seem to be for them, some people very much against them. Please see the link below for that. Also, you can download your free natal horoscope by linking below. And as I said before, if you'd like to have a one-to-one with Elisa or I, please see our links below. We're also immensely grateful to all our lovely Patreons. And I'm going to answer a Patreon question after Elisa has done this card of the week.
I think I would like you to.
Oh, right, thank you. Take a card, any card.
Any card.
That was a British comedian called Tommy Cooper. There you go.
Whoa,
Power.
brilliant.
Well, that is Mars
Very
opposite Pluto.
Power. And this angel is blowing this trumpet, and it's like, whoa, this power is coming through. I think a lot of us, through challenges in our lives, have the power to grow, to have that metamorphosis through that. Because when we have life experience is the most important thing that any of us can ever, have, isn't it? We can get degrees, we can get qualifications in life, we can get promotions at work, and all that is really important. But that life experience that comes from the relationships that we have with people, but most importantly, the relationship with ourselves, is that power, is where that comes from. So if we are feeling a little shy at times, if we are feeling a little bit meek in our lives at times, I really feel like that could change in the next week. We might have a gust of power and assertiveness come through, which is really exciting.
That's fabulous. And that Mars opposite Pluto, I mean, it's brilliant if you're wanting to leap off the settee. If you've been a born-again couch potato through COVID, and sort of like it's got really hard to even sort of shuffle out to get your next bit of extra calorific goodies. If you're anything like me, I can hardly walk. It's just like I just need to go get more ice cream. The Mars opposite Pluto can really push us to test our endurance. We've just got a couple of new fold-up bikes that we got second hand off the internet. It's just arrived. Elisa went and got the helmets yesterday. They're blue, so we're matching. So we're now the blue arrows.
Yes, and we're going to take them for a spin and go along with our Patreons this afternoon. So really excited.
We're going to share something special with our Patreons. But that power card that you're talking about is brilliant to find that extra spark of motivation. But push back also against someone who's using their power in a negative or unfair way. But we have to be aware that when Mars and Pluto are involved, both in cardinal signs of Cancer, where Mars isn't happy, and Pluto in Capricorn, where it's very material, there is almost kind of like a struggle for the soul that's going on at the moment. And there's a lot of miscommunication with that solar eclipse being bogged down by the Mercury retrograde. They do become combust, absolutely, on Friday, the Sun and Mercury, but on Thursday, on the eclipse, that square with Neptune is going to be mischief making, I feel. So the more we can sort of push back to find that flame to overcome any lethargy or innovation that we may be feeling, it's a good thing to do. Now, Jane M, one of our lovely subscribers on Patreon. Jane, you asked, what's the importance of an unaspected sun? It's a brilliant question. So if we think about the natal map, most of the time, but not always, planets have a connection with something else. So they could be right on a cusp. For example, with Sophie's chart that we just been looking at there, her Pluto in her natal chart is right on her 10th house, which suggests work or her relationship with a powerful father or caregiver when she was a child is likely to be a major part of her existence. But if we don't have a planet on a cusp, or it's not aspected by a fixed star, or it's not connecting with another planet, it's known as being unaspected. And it's said that this gives the sun much more raw power. Because if you think about it, without the sun, we're finished. If you think about it, if the sun goes, when I was a kid, we used to have, in Britain, we used to have electricity meters. Some people still have them. And if the money ran out in the electricity meter, you couldn't cook. There was no light. The candles came out. It happened quite frequently in my childhood. And if we didn't have the sun, the innate power that drives our whole solar system is gone. So if you think that there is nothing else on the sun, even if it's a good aspect, like Jupiter trine the sun that I mentioned before, then you're going to get more innate power. So it's said that people who have unaspected suns, and you can have other planets as well, the power of that particular planet is much stronger, it's much richer, it's much more intense. And therefore, because the sun is the most important of all, it's known as a luminary in astrology, not as a planet, but it is technically therefore seen as the most important force of all. So if it's unaspected, you're going to be someone who is quite notable and makes quite an impact on the world.
Oh, I love that. Thank you.
So I'd also like to say, please write in your questions, any suggestions for word of the week, and if you would like your birthday analysed for week commencing the 14th of June, please share your time, date and place of birth, and where you're living now. Because with Sophie's chart, you didn't say where you're living now, Sophie. So for your solar return, I had to use Melbourne still, and you may actually be living somewhere else, which would affect it if you were having a professional reading with a colleague of mine. But for now, from the A-Team and the lovely Mrs. Arundell, it is...
Goodbye from him.
And it's goodbye from us.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.